The security guard's hand pressed against my chest as I tried to board the plane I had purchased with my own billion-dollar company's corporate account. "Ma'am, I need to see your ticket again," he said, his voice dripping with suspicion as he looked me up and down like I was some kind of threat. "Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below." "My name is Simone Washington and I'm 42 years old. 6 months ago, if someone had told me that a simple business trip would lead to the most humiliating experience of my life, and ultimately to a $5 billion reckoning, I would have laughed. I had worked my entire adult life to build something that couldn't be taken away from me. I had climbed every mountain, broken through every glass ceiling, and earned every dollar in my bank account. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, in a neighborhood where dreams were fragile things that could shatter at the slightest touch. Our house was a small 2-bedroom with peeling paint and windows that rattled when the wind blew hard. But inside those walls, my parents built a fortress of love, determination, and unwavering belief that their daughter could be anything she wanted to be. My mother, Rosa, cleaned office buildings at night so she could be home when I got back from school. I can still picture her, standing at our kitchen sink at 5 a.m., washing dishes in her uniform before heading out to work. Her hands were always rough from the industrial cleaning chemicals, but they were gentle when she helped me with homework or braided my hair for school. My father, Marcus, worked double shifts at the Ford plant, his hands permanently stained with motor oil and determination. He would come home exhausted, his work clothes covered in grease, but he always had energy for my questions about math problems or science projects. "Education is the one thing nobody can take away from you, baby girl," he would say, his voice rough from 12 hours in a noisy factory. They never went to college themselves, couldn't afford it, they said, but they made sure I understood that education was my ticket to anywhere I wanted to go. Every report card was celebrated like a victory. Every A was proof that their sacrifices meant something. Every achievement was evidence that the American dream wasn't just a fairy tale told to keep poor people working. "Baby girl," my mother would say as she helped me with homework at our kitchen table, the surface scarred from years of use, "you're going to have to work twice as hard to get half as much. But that doesn't mean you can't get it all." She was right, of course. She was always right about things like that. I learned early that being black in America meant carrying extra weight that others couldn't see. In elementary school, I was the only black child in my advanced classes. Teachers would look surprised when I raised my hand to answer difficult questions, as if intelligence in someone who looked like me was an anomaly that needed explanation. In middle school, I joined the debate team in the science club. I won spelling bees and math competitions. But I also learned to make myself smaller, to speak more quietly, to smile more often. I learned that excellence wasn't just about being smart, it was about being smart in a way that didn't threaten anyone, didn't challenge anyone's assumptions about what smart looked like. High school brought new challenges and new lessons. I was one of only 12 black students in a school of 800. I took every advanced placement class available, maintained a 4.0 GPA, and spent my evenings tutoring younger students. But I also heard whispers in the hallways about affirmative action, about how I was only in those classes because of my race, not my abilities. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, a well-meaning white woman with graying hair and kind eyes, called me into her office during my junior year. "Simone," she said, her voice gentle but patronizing, "have you considered looking at historically black colleges? I think you'd be more comfortable there." More comfortable. As if comfort was what I was seeking. As if I hadn't already proven that I belonged wherever I chose to be. I earned a full scholarship to Stanford, where I studied computer science and business. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I remember holding it in our small living room, reading it aloud to my parents as tears streamed down all our faces. My mother kept saying, "Thank you, Jesus," while my father just kept repeating, "That's my girl. That's my smart girl." Stanford was a different world entirely. The campus was beautiful, sprawling, filled with students who seemed to glide through life with an ease I had never experienced. While my classmates were pledging sororities and going to parties in dormitories that cost more per semester than my family's annual income, I was in the library or working part-time jobs to send money home. I remember my first computer science class, walking into a lecture hall filled with 200 students. I counted exactly 4 other black faces in that sea of mostly white and Asian students. The professor, Dr. Kowalski, was a brilliant man who spoke in rapid-fire sentences about algorithms and data structures. But when he looked out at his class, his eyes seemed to skip over me entirely as if I was invisible. It was in that class that I met Jennifer Kim, a Korean-American student who would become my closest friend and eventually my chief technology officer. Jennifer was everything I wasn't: confident, outspoken, unafraid to challenge professors when she disagreed with them. She also had something I desperately wanted, the assumption that she belonged there. "You're smarter than half these guys," she told me after I had correctly solved a complex programming problem that had stumped most of the class. "Why do you act like you're afraid to show it?" I couldn't explain to her then what I barely understood myself, that being smart while black meant walking a tightrope between achievement and acceptance. Too little success and you confirmed stereotypes. Too much success and you were seen as a threat, an anomaly, someone who had taken a spot that rightfully belonged to someone else. The tech industry in the early 2000s was not particularly welcoming to young black women. I remember walking into my first job interview at a major tech company in Silicon Valley. The interviewer, a middle-aged white man in a wrinkled button-down shirt and khaki pants, looked genuinely surprised when I walked in. He glanced down at his notes, then back at me, then at his notes again. "Oh," he said, consulting his papers, "you're Simone Washington? I was expecting." He trailed off, but I knew exactly what he was expecting. Someone who looked different. Someone who fit his mental image of what a Stanford computer science graduate should look like. The interview went well, technically speaking. I answered every question correctly, demonstrated my coding skills, and articulated my vision for how technology could solve real-world problems. But I could see in his eyes that none of it mattered. He had made his decision the moment I walked through the door. I didn't get that job. Or the next one. Or the one after that. Each rejection was polite, professional, accompanied by form letters that praised my qualifications while explaining that they had decided to go with someone who was a better fit for the company culture. But I kept going because my parents didn't raise me to quit. Finally, after 4 months of searching, I landed a position at a mid-sized software company called Dataflow Systems. The salary was lower than I had hoped, and the work was less challenging than I wanted, but it was a foot in the door of an industry I was determined to conquer. At Dataflow, I worked 70-hour weeks and watched less qualified colleagues get promoted over me. I smiled through meetings where my ideas were ignored, only to hear them repeated by male colleagues who suddenly became brilliant innovators. I endured comments about my natural rhythm when I successfully debugged a particularly complex piece of code, and praise for being articulate when I presented to clients. There was the time my manager, a pale, thin man named Kevin who still lived with his mother at age 35, assigned me to debug a system that had been broken for months. "This seems like something you'd be good at," he said, implying that untangling messes was somehow my specialty. When I fixed it in 3 days, he took credit for the solution in front of the entire team. There was the company retreat where I was the only black employee, and the HR director asked me to share my perspective on diversity during a team-building exercise, as if my entire professional identity could be reduced to my race. There was a client meeting where the customer, a gruff man in his 50s, directed all his questions to my male colleagues, even though I was the technical lead on the project. When I tried to answer, he would nod politely and then turn back to the men for confirmation. But I was learning. I was watching. I was planning. Every slight, every microaggression, every moment of being overlooked or underestimated was teaching me something valuable about how the world worked. I was building not just technical skills but emotional armor. I was developing not just professional expertise but strategic thinking. After 5 years of climbing someone else's ladder only to watch others leap over me, I decided to build my own. I used my savings, every penny I had managed to accumulate while sending money home to my parents, maxed out my credit cards, and launched TechVision Solutions from my one-bedroom apartment in Oakland. The apartment was tiny, with thin walls and a kitchen that was barely big enough for one person. I converted the living room into my office, filling it with computers, monitors, and the constant hum of servers. My bedroom became my conference room, where I held video calls with potential clients while sitting on my bed with my laptop. TechVision specialized in AI-powered logistics software for major corporations. It was unglamorous work, helping companies track inventory, optimize supply chains, manage warehouses, but it was necessary work and I was good at it. More importantly, it was work that could scale, that could grow from a one-person operation into something much bigger. The first year was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. I ate ramen noodles for months, not because I was a poor college student trying to save money, but because I was a grown woman with a Stanford degree who had bet everything on a dream that might not work out. I slept on an air mattress so I could afford better servers. I wore the same 3 business outfits in rotation, washing them in my kitchen sink to save money on dry cleaning. I pitched to investors who looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "It's an interesting idea," they would say, leaning back in their leather chairs in conference rooms that cost more to furnish than I made in a year, "but do you really think you can scale this?" The subtext was always there, hanging in the air like smog. Do you really think someone like you can build something like this? Some were more direct in their skepticism. This market is very competitive, one venture capitalist told me, his voice dripping with condescension. Are you sure you have the experience to compete with established players? Another asked if I had considered partnering with a more experienced entrepreneur who could serve as CEO while I focused on the technical aspects. But TechVision grew slowly and steadily. I landed my first client, a small manufacturing company in San Jose that needed help tracking their inventory. The contract was worth $50,000, not enough to make me rich but enough to prove that my idea could work. That first client led to a second, then a third. Each success built on the previous one. Word spread through industry networks about the young black woman who had built software that could optimize supply chains better than systems that cost 10 times as much. Potential clients started calling me instead of the other way around. We landed our first major client in our second year, a Fortune 500 retail company that was struggling with inventory management across 2,000 stores. The contract was worth $2 million over 3 years, enough to hire employees and move to a real office. I remember the day I signed that contract, sitting in my car in the parking lot outside the client's headquarters, calling my parents to tell them their daughter's crazy dream was actually working. Within 3 years, we were processing logistics for Fortune 500 companies across the country. Major retailers were using our software to manage their supply chains. Manufacturing companies were using our systems to optimize their operations. Technology companies were licensing our AI algorithms to power their own logistics platforms. I hired Jennifer Kim away from Google, where she had been working as a senior engineer. "Are you crazy?" she asked when I offered her the job. "You want me to leave Google to work for a company I've never heard of?" "I want you to help me build something that matters," I told her. "I want you to be part of creating technology that doesn't just make rich people richer, but actually solves real problems for real companies." She joined as my chief technology officer, and together we built a team of brilliant engineers, data scientists, and product managers. We created an office culture that valued innovation over politics, results over relationships, excellence over everything else. Within 5 years, we were the fastest-growing logistics technology company in the country. We had offices in San Francisco, New York, Chicago, and Atlanta. We had 500 employees and contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Technology magazines were writing articles about our innovative AI algorithms. Business journals were profiling me as one of the most successful young entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. By my 40th birthday, TechVision Solutions was valued at over $2 billion. I had 3,000 employees across 15 offices, and my software was running supply chains for some of the biggest companies in the world. I owned 3 homes, one in San Francisco, one in Martha's Vineyard, and one in Detroit near where I grew up. I drove a Tesla, wore designer clothes, and had more money than my parents could have ever imagined. But more than the money, I had something else: respect. When I walked into the boardroom, people listened. When I spoke at conferences, audiences leaned forward. When I shared my opinions on industry trends, reporters quoted me in major publications. I had built something that couldn't be dismissed or diminished. I had earned my place at every table I chose to sit at. Or so I thought. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in October, one of those crisp fall days in San Francisco when the fog had lifted early and the sun was painting the city in golden light. I was flying from SFO to JFK for a board meeting with Meridian Retail, one of our biggest clients. They were considering expanding our contract to include their international operations, a deal that would be worth an additional $500 million over 5 years. I had taken this flight dozens of times before, always in first class, always without incident. Flying first class wasn't about luxury for me, though I certainly appreciated the comfort after years of economy seats and middle-of-the-night layovers. It was about efficiency. First class meant priority boarding, priority baggage handling, and the ability to work productively during the flight. When you're running a billion-dollar company, time is literally money. That morning I was wearing a tailored navy blazer from Armani, a crisp white blouse, and dark slacks that had been altered to fit perfectly. My pearl earrings had been a gift from my mother when TechVision went public. I was carrying a Louis Vuitton briefcase that cost more than most people's monthly rent, filled with documents, contracts, and my laptop. I looked every inch the successful executive I had worked so hard to become. But as I approached Gate B23 at SFO, something felt different. The energy in the air was charged with a tension I couldn't immediately identify. The gate agent, a young blonde woman with perfectly applied makeup and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, looked at my boarding pass with unusual scrutiny. "First class?" she asked, her voice pitched with barely concealed surprise as if I had claimed to be flying to the moon. Yes, I replied, maintaining my professional smile and handing her my ID along with the boarding pass. Seat 2A. She stared at my boarding pass for what felt like an eternity, then looked at me, then back at the boarding pass. Her eyes moved from my face to my clothes to my briefcase and back to my face, as if she was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense to her. Can I see your ID, please? She asked, even though I had already handed it to her. I pointed to the driver's license in her hand, the same one I had used to check in online just 24 hours earlier. She examined it like it was a counterfeit bill, holding it up to the light and comparing my face to the photo multiple times. Behind me, other passengers were starting to notice the delay, and I could feel their impatience building. Is there a problem? I asked, trying to keep my voice level and professional. No problem, she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. Just following protocol. Protocol. I had flown millions of miles over the past decade, had elite status with 3 different airlines, and had never experienced this particular protocol. But I said nothing, took my documents back, and proceeded to board the plane. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 777 was nearly empty when I arrived. Only 3 other passengers had boarded before me, all of them white men in business suits who had passed through the gate without any additional scrutiny. I settled into seat 2A, stowed my briefcase in the overhead compartment, and pulled out my laptop to review the presentation I would be giving later that day. The presentation was crucial. Meridian Retail was considering not just expanding our contract, but making TechVision their exclusive logistics technology partner worldwide. It would be the largest deal in our company's history, and it would cement our position as the dominant player in retail logistics software. I was deep in my preparation when the flight attendant approached my seat. She was a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing the standard uniform but carrying herself with an authority that suggested she had been doing this job for many years. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sweet but firm, like a kindergarten teacher addressing a child who had wandered into the wrong classroom. "I think there might be some confusion. This is a first-class seat." I looked up from my laptop, genuinely confused. "Yes, I know. This is my seat. 2A. May I see your boarding pass, please?" For the second time in 10 minutes, I handed over my boarding pass to an airline employee who seemed incapable of believing that I belonged where I was sitting. She examined it with the same intense scrutiny as the gate agent, holding it up to the light as if checking for watermarks. "I'm going to need to verify this with the gate," she said, walking away with my boarding pass before I could respond. I sat there, in my assigned seat that I had paid for with my company's corporate credit card, watching other passengers board the plane. A white man in a wrinkled polo shirt and cargo shorts walked past me into seat 1A. No one asked to see his boarding pass. A young white woman in yoga pants and flip-flops settled into seat 3A. No one questioned her right to be there. An elderly white man with a newspaper and a coffee took seat 4A. No one demanded verification of his identity. The flight attendant returned 5 minutes later with the gate agent in tow, both of them now looking at me with barely concealed annoyance, as if my presence was somehow disrupting their otherwise smooth operation. "Ma'am, we need to verify your identity," the gate agent said, her voice loud enough for half the plane to hear. "I've already shown you my ID," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. "Twice. We need to verify that you actually purchased this ticket." The words hit me like a physical blow. In all my years of flying, hundreds of flights, millions of miles, elite status with multiple airlines, no one had ever questioned whether I had legitimately purchased my ticket. I was a 42-year-old CEO flying on my company's account to a business meeting that would be worth $500 million, and they were treating me like a teenager with a stolen credit card. "I can show you my corporate credit card," I said, reaching for my wallet. "I can show you the confirmation email. I can give you my company's travel agent's phone number." "That won't be necessary," the gate agent said, but her tone suggested it absolutely would be necessary. "We just need to run some additional checks." The entire first-class cabin had gone silent. Every passenger was staring at me, watching this drama unfold like it was some kind of in-flight entertainment. I could see the mixture of curiosity, embarrassment, and judgment in their eyes. Some looked sympathetic, but most just looked uncomfortable, as if my presence was somehow disrupting their peaceful morning. It was then that I noticed him, a man in a security uniform standing at the entrance to the first-class cabin. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair and the kind of stern expression that suggested he enjoyed his authority a little too much. His hand was resting casually on his belt, near a radio and what I assumed was pepper spray or a taser. Ma'am, I need you to come with me, he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. Excuse me? I stood up, my laptop sliding off my lap and onto the seat. Come with you where? We need to verify your identity and your right to be on this aircraft. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. My right to be on this aircraft. As if flying while black was a privilege that could be revoked at any moment, as if my presence needed to be justified and approved by people who had no business questioning it. I have shown you my ID multiple times, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. I have my boarding pass. I have my credit card. I have my corporate travel authorization. What more do you need? Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to involve law enforcement. The threat hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I looked around at the other passengers, searching for some sign of support, some indication that what was happening was wrong, that someone else could see the injustice unfolding before their eyes. But they all looked away, suddenly fascinated by their phones or their magazines or the safety card in their seat pocket. I thought about my parents, about all the times they had told me to keep my head down, to not make waves, to be twice as good and half as loud. I thought about the little girl who had studied so hard and worked so diligently to earn her place in the world. I thought about the young woman who had swallowed her pride and smiled through countless microaggressions in Silicon Valley boardrooms and venture capital offices. I thought about the CEO who had built a billion-dollar company from nothing, who had earned the respect of Fortune 500 executives, who commanded attention in conference rooms across the country. I thought about the woman who had worked 18-hour days for 20 years to prove that she belonged anywhere she chose to be. And I realized that none of it mattered. Not my degree from Stanford. Not my company. Not my success. Not my tailored blazer or my expensive briefcase or my first-class boarding pass purchased with money I had earned through intelligence, determination, and sheer force of will. At that moment, I wasn't Simone Washington, CEO of TechVision Solutions. I was just another black woman who didn't look like she belonged in first class. Fine, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the word tasting like defeat in my mouth. Let's go. The security guard led me off the plane like a criminal, his hand hovering near my elbow as if I might suddenly bolt for the jetway. The other passengers watched us go, their eyes burning into my back like laser beams. Some looked embarrassed, others looked curious, but most just looked relieved that the disturbance was being removed from their vicinity. The walk from the plane to the security office felt like a perp walk, even though I hadn't committed any crime beyond the apparent offense of being successful while black. Other passengers in the gate area stopped their conversations to stare as we passed. Children pointed and asked their parents what was happening. Business travelers looked up from their laptops with expressions that ranged from sympathy to judgment. The security office was a small, windowless room near Gate B23, with fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows on everyone's faces and made everything look slightly green. The furniture consisted of a metal desk, 3 plastic chairs that looked like they had been salvaged from a school cafeteria, and a filing cabinet that had seen better decades. I sat in one of the plastic chairs while 3 security personnel stood around me like I was some kind of flight risk. The original security guard was joined by his supervisor, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and tired eyes, and another guard who looked young enough to be my nephew. We need to verify that you purchased this ticket legitimately, the first security guard said, his tone suggesting he already believed I hadn't. I pulled out my phone and showed them my credit card statement, complete with the charge from Continental Airways dated 3 days earlier. I showed them my company's travel booking confirmation, complete with my corporate account information and the authorization code. I showed them my corporate American Express card, my driver's license, my Stanford alumni ID and my business cards. I am the CEO of TechVision Solutions, I explained, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. My company is valued at over $2 billion. I fly this route regularly for business meetings. I have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars with Continental Airways over the past 5 years. They looked at my documentation with the same skepticism they might reserve for a teenager trying to buy alcohol with a fake ID. The supervisor made phone calls to verify my identity, speaking in low voices as if I might be running some elaborate con game involving stolen credit cards and forged business documents. Ma'am, the supervisor finally said after 20 minutes of phone calls and consultations, we're going to need to do a more thorough background check. A background check? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For what? I'm trying to fly to New York for a business meeting, not apply for a security clearance with the CIA. It's for the safety of all passengers, she replied, but her eyes told a different story. This wasn't about safety. This was about a black woman who didn't look like she belonged in first class, at least not in their minds. This was about assumptions and biases and the deeply ingrained belief that success and blackness were somehow incompatible. While they ran their background check, I sat in that cramped office and thought about all the times I had been made to feel like I didn't belong. The college professor who had questioned whether I had written my own thesis suggested that perhaps I had received too much help from tutors or study groups. The venture capitalist who had asked if I had any real business experience, as if building a company from nothing didn't count as real experience. The board member at one of our client companies who had suggested I might be more comfortable in a different type of leadership role, perhaps something in human resources or community relations. I thought about the countless meetings where I had been the only black person in the room, where every word I spoke was scrutinized and analyzed in ways that my white colleagues' words never were. I thought about the conferences where people assumed I was someone's assistant rather than a keynote speaker. I thought about the networking events where potential clients would talk past me to male colleagues, even when I was the one with the expertise they needed. I had swallowed my pride so many times that I was surprised I had any left. I had smiled through microaggressions, laughed off inappropriate comments, and graciously accepted backhanded compliments that were designed to diminish rather than elevate. I had been the articulate one, the credit to my race, the exception that proved the rule rather than the rule itself. But sitting in that office, being treated like a criminal for the crime of being successful while black, I felt something inside me shift. I felt my patience, my professionalism, my willingness to be accommodating and understanding start to crumble like a dam that had been holding back years of accumulated frustration and anger. They kept me in that office for 2 hours. 2 hours while my flight took off without me, while I missed my connection to New York, while I had to call my assistant and ask her to reschedule one of the most important meetings in my company's history. 2 hours while I explained to Meridian Retail's board of directors that I wouldn't be making our meeting because an airline had decided I looked too suspicious to fly. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Washington," said Patricia Hendricks, Meridian CEO, when I called to explain the situation. "That's absolutely unacceptable. We can reschedule for tomorrow, of course, but I want you to know that we'll be having some serious conversations with Continental Airways about this incident." When the security team finally cleared me to travel, it was with the kind of grudging reluctance usually reserved for granting parole to a repeat offender. "You can rebook on the next flight," the supervisor said, as if she was doing me a tremendous favor. "In first class?" I asked. "Coach is all we have available," she replied, and I could swear I saw a hint of satisfaction in her eyes, as if my humiliation was somehow a victory for her. I spent the next 8 hours in various airports trying to get to New York. I was rebooted on 3 different flights, squeezed into middle seats between passengers who seemed determined to claim every available inch of armrest space. I arrived in New York exhausted, humiliated, and furious, but I also arrived with something else: clarity. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to smile and move on. I wasn't going to chalk it up to a misunderstanding or an overzealous security protocol. I wasn't going to be the bigger person, who rises above it all and focuses on the positive. I wasn't going to write it off as an isolated incident that didn't reflect broader systemic problems. I was going to do something about it. Something big. Something that would make sure this never happened to anyone else. The next morning, I called my lawyer from my hotel room overlooking Central Park. Sarah Chin had been my legal counsel for 5 years, handling everything from contract negotiations to intellectual property disputes to the occasional defamation threat from competitors who couldn't understand how a black woman could build a better product than their teams of Ivy League engineers. Sarah was sharp, aggressive, and had never lost a case that mattered. She was also one of the few people in my professional life who understood what it meant to be a woman of color in a male-dominated industry. As a Korean-American attorney who had built her own practice after being passed over for partner at 3 different white shoe law firms, she had her own collection of stories about being underestimated and overlooked. "Simone," she said when I finished telling her what had happened, her voice tight with controlled anger, "I'm so sorry. That sounds absolutely horrific." "It was," I replied, staring out at the joggers in Central Park below. "But I want to know what my options are. Legally, I mean." "Well, you could file a discrimination complaint with the Department of Transportation. We could also look into a civil rights lawsuit under Section 1981. The problem is, proving discrimination can be challenging. They'll claim it was a routine security check, that it had nothing to do with race. They'll point to Post 9/11 security protocols and argue that they were just being thorough. What if I told you I had a different idea?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I'm listening." "What if I told you that I've been thinking about expanding TechVision into new markets? specifically into airline logistics and operations. I could hear her sharp intake of breath through the phone. Simone, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that Continental Airways processes about 50 million passengers a year. I'm thinking that their current logistics system is antiquated and inefficient. I'm thinking that their technology infrastructure is at least a decade behind their competitors. I'm thinking that a smart, well-funded company could develop a better system and potentially win a very large contract. Are you talking about what I think you're talking about? I'm talking about building the best airline operations system in the world. I'm talking about creating technology that's so superior to what currently exists that Continental Airways won't be able to ignore it. I'm talking about making them an offer they can't refuse. And then, when they're completely dependent on my technology, when my software is running their entire operation, I'm talking about having a conversation with them about customer service and corporate values. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. That's actually brilliant. But it would take months, maybe years. And it would cost millions of dollars. I have time, I said. And I have money. And I have motivation. What about the discrimination lawsuit? We'll file it. But that's not how I'm going to win this. Lawsuits drag on for years, and even if we win, what do we get? A settlement with a confidentiality agreement that prevents me from talking about what happened? A formal apology that nobody will remember in 6 months. So what do you want instead? I want to change the system. I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else. I want to show Continental Airways exactly who they refuse to let sit in first class. Over the next 6 months, I poured everything I had into what I privately called Project Payback. I hired the best software engineers in the country, many of them from companies that had previously overlooked me or declined to hire me early in my career. There was a certain poetic justice in recruiting talent from Google, Microsoft, and Amazon to build something that would revolutionize an industry that had treated me with such disrespect. I hired Dr. David Kim from MIT's Artificial Intelligence Lab, offering him twice his academic salary and unlimited research budget. I recruited Maria Gonzalez from SpaceX, where she had been developing autonomous navigation systems for rockets. I brought in James Powell from the NSA, where he had been working on predictive analytics for national security applications. Together, we assembled a team of 50 of the brightest minds in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and logistics optimization. I bought cutting-edge servers, invested in quantum computing research, and allocated $500 million toward developing the most sophisticated airline operations system ever created. The system we built was unlike anything that existed in the industry. It could predict weather delays 3 days in advance with 94% accuracy. It could optimize flight paths in real time to save fuel and reduce emissions. It could manage baggage handling so efficiently that lost luggage would become a thing of the past. It could process passenger data so quickly that check-in times would be cut in half. But the real innovation was in the integrated approach. Most airline technology systems were built piecemeal over decades, with different vendors providing different solutions that barely communicated with each other. Our system was designed from the ground up as a unified platform that could manage every aspect of airline operations from a single interface. It was revolutionary. It was game-changing. And it was exactly what Continental Airways needed, even if they didn't know it yet. I spent months studying their operations, learning their pain points, and understanding their inefficiencies. I hired former Continental employees who could give me insider knowledge about their systems and processes. I attended industry conferences where Continental executives spoke, taking detailed notes on their challenges and priorities. I learned that Continental was hemorrhaging money due to operational inefficiencies. Their on-time performance was among the worst in the industry. Their customer satisfaction ratings were declining year over year. Their fuel costs were 15% higher than their main competitors due to poor route optimization. Their baggage handling system lost or damaged luggage at twice the industry average. Most importantly, I learned that their current technology contracts were up for renewal in 18 months. They would be looking for new solutions, new vendors, new approaches to solving problems that had been plaguing them for years. By the spring, I was ready to make my move. I reached out to Continental's chief operating officer, a man named Richard Sterling who had been with the airline for 15 years. He had an engineering background and a reputation for being open to innovative solutions, even from unconventional sources. Mr. Sterling, I said during our first phone call, I'd like to present TechVision's airline operations system as a revolutionary solution to Continental's operational challenges. Ms. Washington, he replied, his voice cautious but intrigued, I have to admit, I'm not familiar with TechVision's work in the airline industry. That's because we're new to this space, I said. But we're not new to solving complex logistics problems for Fortune 500 companies. And we've developed something that I believe will transform how airlines operate. The first meeting took place in Continental's headquarters in Houston, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that rose from the prairie like a monument to corporate ambition. I arrived with a team of 5 engineers and a presentation that lasted 2 hours. We demonstrated how our AI could predict passenger flow patterns with 99.7% accuracy. We showed how our logistics optimization could reduce fuel costs by 23%. We explained how our baggage handling system had eliminated lost luggage entirely in our test scenarios. We detailed how our customer service integration could reduce complaint resolution time by 78%. Richard Sterling and his team sat in stunned silence as we walked through simulation after simulation, showing them how our system could solve problems they had been struggling with for decades. "Ms. Washington," Sterling said when we finished, "this is impressive work. But implementing a new system like this would be a massive undertaking. The cost, the training, the potential for disruption. We're talking about replacing technology that runs our entire operation." "Mr. Sterling," I replied, "what's the cost of continuing to operate with your current system? What's the cost of delayed flights, lost baggage, inefficient fuel usage, and customer dissatisfaction? What's the cost of falling further behind your competitors while they implement more advanced technology?" I had done my homework. I knew that Continental was struggling with operational efficiency, that they were losing market share to airlines with better technology and better customer service. I knew that their board of directors was pressuring management to find solutions to problems that seemed intractable. "We'd need to see a full demonstration," he said finally. "And we'd need guarantees about implementation timelines and system reliability." "Of course," I said. "I'm prepared to offer you a full system demonstration at one of our test facilities. I'm prepared to provide a phased implementation plan that minimizes disruption to your operations. And I'm prepared to offer a performance guarantee that includes financial penalties if we don't meet our targets." What I didn't tell him was that I was also prepared to offer him a price so low that it would be financial suicide to refuse. I was willing to lose money on this contract. I was willing to lose a lot of money. Because this wasn't about money. This was about justice. This was about transformation. This was about making sure that what happened to me never happened to anyone else. The contract negotiation took 3 months. Continental's board of directors was initially skeptical about partnering with a company they had never heard of for such a critical function. But the demonstration of TechVision's system was so impressive that they couldn't ignore it. Our AI didn't just predict weather delays. It could suggest alternative flight paths that would minimize the impact of storms that wouldn't hit for another 48 hours. Our logistics optimization didn't just reduce fuel costs. It could dynamically adjust routes based on real-time air traffic, weather conditions, and passenger load factors. Our baggage handling system didn't just track luggage. It could predict and prevent the system failures that caused most baggage problems. Most importantly, our system was fully integrated and scalable. Once implemented, Continental would be completely dependent on TechVision software for their entire operation. Every flight, every passenger, every piece of luggage, every operational decision would be managed by systems that I had built. The contract was worth $2.3 billion over 5 years with options for renewal. It was the largest deal in TechVision's history, and it would make Continental Airways the most technologically advanced airline in the world. But the real victory came 6 months later, after our system was fully operational and I had implemented some additional features that weren't explicitly mentioned in our contract. I was in my office in San Francisco when my assistant buzzed me on a Tuesday morning in March. "Ms. Washington, there's a Richard Sterling from Continental Airways on line 1. He says it's urgent." I picked up the phone knowing exactly why he was calling. "Ms. Washington," he said, his voice tight with stress, "we need to talk." "Of course, Mr. Sterling. What can I do for you?" "It's about the security protocols in your system. We've been getting complaints from passengers about excessive screening procedures, particularly for minority travelers. Our customer service ratings have dropped significantly in the past month." I leaned back in my chair, allowing myself a small smile. "That's concerning, Mr. Sterling? What kind of complaints?" "Passengers are saying they're being singled out for additional screening based on their appearance. They're saying our staff is being overly suspicious and discriminatory. Social media is lighting up with stories about racial profiling. We've had 3 viral videos in the past week alone." "I see. And what specific changes would you like me to make?" "We need the system to be more neutral. Less likely to flag passengers based on demographic factors." "Mr. Sterling, I want to make sure I understand. Are you saying that Continental Airways would like to reduce discriminatory screening practices? There was a long pause. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. That's a fascinating request, Mr. Sterling. Because 6 months ago, one of your security guards removed me from a flight because he couldn't believe a black woman belonged in first class. He treated me like a criminal, humiliated me in front of other passengers, and made me miss one of the most important business meetings of my career. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Ms. Washington, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, I had no idea. Of course you didn't. Because when these things happen to people like me, they get filed away as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. But here's the thing, Mr. Sterling, they're not isolated incidents. They're systematic problems that reflect systematic biases in how your company treats passengers who don't look like your typical first-class customer. What do you want us to do? I want you to implement a comprehensive anti-discrimination training program for all Continental Airways employees. I want you to establish a zero-tolerance policy for racial profiling. I want you to create an independent oversight committee to investigate discrimination complaints. And I want you to make a public commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or appearance. And if we don't? Then I'll be forced to conclude that Continental Airways is not the kind of company that TechVision Solutions wants to partner with. And you'll discover how difficult it is to run an airline without the systems that currently manage your entire operation. Richard Sterling was quiet for a long moment. You planned this, didn't you? The contract, the system, all of it. I built the best airline operation system in the world, Mr. Sterling. The fact that it also gives me leverage to demand basic human decency is just a bonus. This is extortion. No, Mr. Sterling. This is justice. Extortion would be if I was asking for money or personal favors. I'm asking you to treat your customers with respect. I'm asking you to train your employees not to discriminate. I'm asking you to be a better company. And if we agree to your terms? Then Continental Airways will continue to benefit from the most advanced airline operations system in the world. Your efficiency ratings will continue to improve, your costs will continue to decrease, and your passengers will have the best flying experience in the industry. You'll also have the satisfaction of knowing that you're treating all of your customers fairly, regardless of what they look like. We'll need time to discuss this with our board. Of course, take all the time you need. But Mr. Sterling? Every day you delay is another day that your customers are being treated unfairly. And every complaint, every bad review, every viral video is a reminder that you chose to prioritize pride over progress. 2 weeks later, Continental Airways announced a comprehensive overhaul of their customer service policies. They implemented mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees, from baggage handlers to senior executives. They established an independent oversight committee with the power to investigate discrimination complaints and recommend disciplinary action. They created a zero-tolerance policy for racial profiling, with immediate termination for any employee found guilty of discriminatory behavior. They also issued a public apology to passengers who had been subjected to discriminatory treatment, and they committed to making Continental Airways the most inclusive and welcoming airline in the world. The announcement made national news. Civil rights organizations praised Continental for taking proactive steps to address discrimination. Industry analysts called it a model for how corporations should respond to bias and prejudice. Social media influencers who had been criticizing the airline suddenly became advocates for their transformation. But the real victory came 3 months later, when I received a personal letter from Richard Sterling. Dear Ms. Washington, I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received on our flight 8 months ago. What happened to you was unacceptable, and I am ashamed that it occurred on our airline. Since implementing the changes you requested, we have seen a dramatic improvement in our customer satisfaction ratings, particularly among minority passengers. More importantly, we have seen a fundamental shift in the culture of our company. Our employees tell us that the training has opened their eyes to biases they didn't even know they had. Our passengers tell us that they feel more welcome and respected when they fly with us. Our shareholders tell us that our improved reputation has translated into increased bookings and higher profits. You didn't just demand justice for yourself. You demanded justice for every passenger who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. You used your success not just to benefit your own company, but to make the entire industry more fair and inclusive. That takes courage, vision, and integrity. Thank you for showing us what leadership really looks like. Sincerely, Richard Sterling, Chief Operating Officer, Continental Airways. I kept that letter in my desk drawer, next to a photo of my parents taken at TechVision's IPO celebration and a printout of our stock price from the day we announced the Continental contract. But the real prize was something I couldn't frame or display, the knowledge that I had turned my humiliation into transformation, not just for myself, but for countless other passengers who would never have to experience what I experienced. 6 months after the Continental Airways incident, I was invited to speak at the National Conference of Minority Entrepreneurs in Atlanta. As I stood on that stage, looking out at an audience of 3,000 young black and brown faces, I thought about the journey that had brought me there. I thought about the little girl in Detroit who had studied so hard to earn her place in the world, who had believed that excellence would be enough to overcome prejudice. I thought about the young woman in Silicon Valley who had swallowed her pride and smiled through countless microaggressions, who had convinced herself that success would make her immune to discrimination. I thought about the CEO who had built a billion-dollar company and still been treated like she didn't belong in first class. And I thought about the security guard who had pressed his hand against my chest and asked to see my ticket again, not knowing that he was about to awaken something inside me that would change everything. They judged me by my skin, I told that audience, my voice carrying across the convention center. They saw my color before they saw my character, my success, my humanity. They tried to make me feel small, insignificant, unworthy of the seat I had paid for with money I had earned through intelligence, determination, and decades of hard work. I paused, looking out at all those young faces, seeing myself in each one of them. But here's what they didn't understand. Discrimination isn't just about the person being discriminated against. It's about the society that allows it to happen. It's about the systems that perpetuate it. It's about the institutions that benefit from it and the people who remain silent when they witness it. So I didn't just fight back for myself. I fought back for everyone who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. I used my success, my resources, my platform to demand change not just for me but for all of us. Because that's what power is really for. Not to elevate ourselves above others but to lift others up with us. Not to escape the systems that oppress us, but to transform them so they can't oppress anyone else. I looked out at that audience one more time, at all those young faces full of hope and determination and dreams that couldn't be diminished by other people's prejudices. They thought they were putting me in my place, I said, my voice rising with conviction. They had no idea that my place was exactly where I needed to be to change theirs. The standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes, but more than the applause, more than the recognition, what mattered was the message I saw in those young faces. That discrimination doesn't have to be the end of the story. That success isn't just about overcoming obstacles, but about removing them for others. That justice isn't just about getting what you deserve, but about making sure everyone gets what they deserve. I had started that journey as a victim of discrimination. I had ended it as an agent of change. And in between, I had learned the most important lesson of all, that our greatest power isn't in the wealth we accumulate or the success we achieve, but in how we use that wealth and success to make the world more fair for everyone who comes after us. That's the real victory. That's the real revenge. That's the real justice. They judged me by my skin. I showed them the strength of my soul. And in doing so, I showed them that the content of our character will always be more powerful than the color of our skin, especially when we use that character to demand justice not just for ourselves, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Because we all belong. Every single one of us. And it's time the world started acting like it.